Thank you for participating in the Humane Summit, a virtual speaker series brought to you by the Humane Education Coalition. This session is sponsored by the Griffin Press and the Humane Society of the United States. We are grateful for your attendance today for Phil Arkow's speaker session, Making Humane Education More Relevant in the 21st Century. Phil is an acclaimed lecturer, author, and educator. He is the coordinator of the National Link Coalition and edits the monthly Link Letter. Phil chairs the Latham Foundation's Animal Abuse and Family Violence Prevention Project. He has presented numerous times around the world and has authored over 80 key reference works on human-animal interactions and violence prevention. At this time, I will pass things over to our speaker, Phil Arkow.
Hi, everybody. I'm Phil Arkow. This is my sidekick, Barnaby. He just wanted to say hello to everybody out there. Say hello, Barnaby. He's my little buddy here, and just in case you hear him barking, you'll know what that's all about. And I want to welcome you to this webinar here. It's called Making Humane Education More Relevant in the 21st Century, or otherwise known as Learn What the Monster Likes and Feed It. And I will explain to you very shortly what that's all about. But the Venn diagram on the left pretty much says the whole thing, which is that when we're talking about animal protection and humane work, we tend to think of ourselves as being isolated in a little bubble. But the fact is that we're just one part of a much bigger continuum of family violence, which includes child abuse, domestic violence, and elder abuse, and animal cruelty. They overlap. And what we have done through our National Link Coalition, which is the National Resource Center on the link between animal abuse and human violence, is train people to recognize that all four of these forms of family violence often occur simultaneously, and we need to be training people in all of these disciplines to be on the lookout and to cross-report. The purpose of this program is to take a new look, actually it's an old look at humane education, and basically go back to the basics. Give you a little bit of background. I started out as a humane educator in 1973 with the Humane Society of the Pikes Peak region, and at that time there were only 6 of us in the entire country who were full-time humane educators, and it's marvelous to me to see how the field has grown. But I've got a lot of experience with this, and it's a new way of looking, or an old way actually, of looking at what we're doing. Here's our information there. Visit our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, and there's my email, arcopets@snip.net, and feel free to contact me, and we'll give you more information about that. Looking backwards a little bit, how did we get here with humane education? Well, philosophers going back as far as Ovid and St. Thomas Aquinas, Montaigne, John Locke, have all said pretty much the same thing, that children who abuse animals often grow up to become abusive adults, and that harming animals implies something's wrong with the human condition. It's bad for society. It desensitizes people against human violence. Going along with the philosophical basis, we have the criminal justice background here, which is that, interestingly enough, the United States has the world's oldest anti-cruelty laws. They go back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1641, and these laws in every single state are rooted in concern for how harming animals harms other people's property, because animals are property. That's deeply embedded in the law, and like it or not, that's not going to change at any time in the foreseeable future. So rather than fight that, let's work with it, and we can make much more progress if we work with that construct than trying to fight it. It was merely 8 years later, in 1649, that we've been able to find the first cases that were prosecuted in Massachusetts of animal abuse cases occurring simultaneously with violence against people in 1649. So the link is deeply embedded in law as well as in philosophy. If you look at children's literature from the Victorian era, it is filled with statements like this. This came from a children's book in 1832 that says, if we learn to be cruel while we're boys, we won't grow up to be good men. The world's first humane education book, world's first children's literature, was Little Goody Two-Shoes. And we've all heard that expression forever. You probably never knew where it came from. The world's first book written specifically for children in the late 1700s. And there's Marjorie Meanwell, and she's a nice little girl who takes care of kitties. And there's these little nasty boys who harm them. The roots of humane education started with George Angell when he founded the Massachusetts SPCA in 1867. And quotes like this from him were indicative of the spirit of the time. Just as soon and so far as we pour into all our schools, the songs, the poems, and literature of mercy towards these lower creatures, then we'll reach the roots not only of cruelty, but also of crime. Why is this important? Look at all of that, and you'll see that nothing in those roots focuses on animals having rights. And in fact, the welfare of animals is secondary to how this issue affects people. It's about animal abuse hurting people. The humane education movement reached its peak in the 1930s when it was mandated in about 30 states. And probably the most emblematic statement came in 1933 from the National PTA and their endorsement of humane education. It said, children trained to extend justice, kindness, and mercy to animals become more just, kind, and considerate in their relations to each other. Cultivating kindness to animals is just the starting point towards a larger humanity, which includes one's fellow of every race and clime. Again, nothing in there about animals' rights. It's about helping create a more humane community, a more civilized society through animal welfare. We've had good news and bad news with humane education over the decades. Unfortunately, these state mandates were never enforced. They've never been evaluated. We have frankly never been able to determine whether or not humane education works, whether our 45-minute presentations, which comprise only 4/10,000ths of 1% of a student's classroom contact time over a 12-year class time experience, never can tell whether we get enough cognitive information to affect their emotions and then create behavioral changes. We've never been able to evaluate that. Humane education has been widely discontinued. It was the first thing that was cut during the 2008 recession, and we had a marvelous study in Indiana and Illinois a number of years ago that found that even though every humane society says that humane education is mission critical, very few shelters actually support it by paying, salaries and providing the materials and making it integral to what they do. We've had any number of challenges with this. We've never even been able to define what we mean by humane education. And the fact is, if you really want to think about it, yes, we're here to teach respect for all living things, but environmental educators are doing the same thing, and zoo educators are doing the same thing, and your high school biology teacher was doing the same thing. Trying to teach respect for living things. Debbie Dool, who used to be the humane educator in Washington, D.C., once asked me a question in violence-prone downtown Washington, D.C. She said, how can I go into a classroom and teach children to be kind to their puppies when these kids are afraid to go to school because of drive-by shootings? And I still don't have an answer to that one. Unfortunately, animal issues are always marginalized. They're not seen as being as important as crimes against people. We really don't know how violence against animals originates, so how can we come up with an educational intervention that's going to solve that? Schools have had budget cutbacks. Shelters have certainly had budget cutbacks. We have no real evidence-based practices about what's the best way to do humane education. There's a crushing lack of cultural competency in humane organizations, so we're missing the boat on that. Better funding from other special interest groups. Everybody's got their own agenda of what they'd like to see in their schools, and we just don't have the resources to compete. The public isn't exactly clamoring for humane education, neither are the parents. The teachers don't want anything more because they've got enough teaching to the test to do and enough instructional mandates that they have to comply with. So we got a long road ahead of us. So how do we deal with all that? Well, let's accept that people always bring their own reality to a conversation, and that other than us crazy animal lovers, human needs are always going to take priority over animal causes. So let's get over it and use that to our advantage. And the way to do that is to change the discussion. This was from a study that the ASPCA commissioned in several southern states a few years back. And they said that law enforcement and the public rank violence against humans above animal cruelty. And though animal abuse is fairly important, it just can't compete. But the research demonstrating the links between animal abuse and human violence has a direct effect on how seriously law enforcement and the public take animal cruelty issues. This was from a marketing study done in Canada, looking at the status of Canadian animal shelters a few years back. And I love this quote. They said, the philosophy in the animal welfare community is switching to addressing human problems that underlie crises with animals. Animal shelter service philosophy is evolving to recognize that treating the symptoms of animal welfare problems, such as homelessness and abuse and neglect, is only a stopgap solution. To be truly effective, the underlying causes, such as community and family dysfunction and violence, must be addressed. So the way we do this is we reposition the animal shelter as a central agency in the community to prevent all forms of family violence, focusing on the animal component of that. And what we do is let's change our message to focus on three things that affect people. One is called social capital. I don't have time to go into that, but the fact is that communities where people have pets are more civically engaged, people vote more often, people trust their neighbors more, there's more of a sense of community, there's more of a communitarian spirit. So animal welfare helps the community as well. The health benefits, the neurochemical things that happen when we're petting animals, dog bite prevention, the One Health movement, linking veterinary and human medicine, animal-assisted therapy. These are all positive ways in which animal welfare helps people. And then this link, how animal abuse is part of this broader continuum of family and community violence. By taking a species-spanning approach, we have an easier time getting into schools, and we can be much more effective and integrated in our outreach and community programming. It's a pragmatic strategy I call learn what the monster likes and feed it. Actually, I didn't make that up. A high school teacher told me that once. I asked him, I said, what do I have to do to get an A on this paper? He said, learn what the monster likes and feed it. Find out what your audience wants. And if your audience wants to focus on human issues rather than animal issues, you take your message and package it in a way that they understand. Let's rebrand what we do in humane education as not just being kind to animals, but as being a violence prevention program from a community services agency that's protecting the health and safety of all vulnerable members of the family and the community. Rebrand what we do is fitting in with existing standards, core standards that they need on character education. And by preventing animal abuse, we are preventing human violence in areas that teachers and school administrators care about. We can talk about the impact on children's development and health, and that's everything from kids who perpetrate animal abuse to children who witness animal abuse. We know that animal cruelty is one of the earliest indicators of conduct disorders, starts showing up about the age of 6.5. We talk about the link between animal abuse and child abuse and domestic violence, the impact on bullying, and the impact on school safety and school shooting. These are messages that teachers want to hear and their students need to hear. When we see, the typical picture of a child and playing with his puppy under the sun, that's great. But the picture on the right is more problematic. When children are drawing pictures of animals that have had their throats slashed, we have a child who is definitely in need of counseling and intervention. Andrew Vox, who's a world famous child psychiatrist and an authority on child abuse, has called animal abuse the Rosetta Stone of predatory psychopathology. He says the youth who throws a rock at a flock of pigeons isn't so much endangering us as endangering an animal, as he's giving us a chance to intervene at the crossroads. We can teach empathy or we can encourage cruelty. We know from research that children who witness animal cruelty, not just perpetrating it, but witnessing it, much more likely to have histories of child abuse, to witness other family violence, and to grow up to become adolescent or adult offenders. And children's committing animal abuse has been linked with any number of risk factors, including fire setting, bullying, other crime, lack of empathy, corporal punishment, physical and sexual abuse, exposure to domestic violence, and other psychiatric disorders such as antisocial personality disorder. The link is this. It's very simple. Usually in a domestic violence context, the batterer, who's usually a male but not always, attacks the people in the household, the survivor, and the animals in the household as a pawn to keep everybody trapped and off guard. The survivors stay, the children are exposed to all this, they grow up to become violent or victims themselves, and they wind up repeating the whole process all over again. The research is pretty compelling. These are just some of the many studies we have in our bibliography here. New Jersey study found that 60% of families that were being investigated for child abuse also had animal abuse. And 88% of those families, there was animal abuse where it was physical child abuse. There are also 11 times more dog bites in those households. So we're dealing with a rabies and a physical trauma issue. A study in Alberta, Canada found that children who are exposed to domestic violence are 3 times more likely to be cruel to animals. A Colorado 5-year-long study that's recently concluded found that children who have been exposed to animal abuse in households where there's domestic violence much more likely to have severe problems and to be struggling and to be less resilient than their peers. A study in Utah found that 32% of women in shelters reported that their children hurt or killed animals. A Wisconsin study found 75% of animal abuse intended to coerce a domestic violence survivor was done in the presence of the children. Statistics like these are things that teachers can understand. When it comes to bullying, we find higher rates of animal abuse not only among youth who bully others, as we would expect, but among youth who have been bullied as a way to transfer the aggression that's been directed against them against another creature. And there are 2 different philosophies about this. It could be the graduation hypothesis. It could be that they start out hurting animals, develop a desensitization, and move on to hurting people. But it's actually more likely a general pattern of deviance, where the animal abuse may come first or second. It's just part of a whole constellation of antisocial behaviors. The school safety issue is everything every teacher in this world cares about. And we know that at least 43% of school shooters are also torturing animals. And one outcome of some of that research occurred just last July when the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center looked at those numbers and issued a statement calling willful, malicious animal cruelty a possible warning sign for terrorism. That should be able to get us into schools fairly easily. So what do we do with all this? Well, we've got lots of resources at the National Link Coalition. One of our newest ones is this free PowerPoint that you're welcome to use and customize. It's called The Cruelty Connection, Animal Abuse and its Links to Human Violence. It's a free 28-slide PowerPoint geared for high school audiences that you can customize with your own information. It comes with lesson notes. It gives you an opportunity to talk about your organization, let the students interact with you as to why their pets are important to them and how animals enrich our lives and why it's bad to hurt their lives. You can go into detail about what your state's laws are and some basic, simple information about how animal abuse hurts people, how to report animal abuse, and how the court systems work and why more cases of animal cruelty aren't prosecuted and how we can change that. It's on our website, nationallinkcoalition.org. Just go into our resource tab. You'll see a whole tab with resources there, and look under the general fact sheets and overviews. We have these all broken out by category, so because there's so much of it. Look at the general fact sheets and you'll see the link for student PowerPoint and lesson plans there. Just a quick little reality check. Yes, animal abuse is a red flag for interpersonal violence, but it may be this pattern of general deviance. It may be a violence graduation, escalation situation there. And we also need to be aware that not all kids who abuse animals grow up to become psychopaths or serial killers. We also need to realize that some children who are bombarded by violence seek comfort in their animals and try to protect them. So wrapping up here, because I only have a couple of minutes, why should teachers care about humane education? The great anthropologist Margaret Mead probably said it better than anybody. She said one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. It's really just as simple as that. So what should you get out of all this? What's your takeaway? I'd like to think your takeaway is this, that while teaching kids to be kind to animals is certainly a nice thing to do, it's definitely the right thing to do, it's only when leaders recognize that animal abuse has adverse effects on the human animal that animal maltreatment will become culturally unacceptable. And we'll be able to make real lasting changes, including in school curricula. Because when animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. And that's what the link, as we call it, is really all about. So I don't know that we'll have time for questions here in this format, but I'd love to get your questions. Feel free to check out all the free resources on our website. We have a free monthly newsletter called the Link Letter. If you'd like to get it, just shoot me an email. Tell me what organization you're with. There's my email, my phone number, and website contact. And so thank you for being a part of the summit here. And let me turn it back over to Megan.
This concludes our speaker session. Thank you so much for joining us. You can learn more here or by clicking the resource links in the summit. We hope you've enjoyed this speaker session and that you'll join us for another one soon. Please consider making a donation to the Humane Education Coalition to help us continue providing programs and events like the Humane Summit. We rely on your support to help create a more compassionate, just, and sustainable future through education. Visit hecoalition.org/give to contribute today. Thanks again.